Hello aspirants and welcome again to Legacy IAS Academy. In this lecture, we will be discussing about India's GDP number swings. What this swing is, the fluctuation of the GDP growth rate, and in that we'll understand what is the key for sustaining growth rate. We'll also understand what is the reason for this fluctuation, what can be thought of the reason for fluctuation, and what is actually the reason of this fluctuation, and what should we do in order to sustain the growth. So why all this is because there has been a fluctuation in GDP growth rate. So if you look at India's recent growth trajectory, you will see that there has been from volatility to stability is what we want. However, if you look at the last year or few quarters, you will see that there have been huge amount of fluctuation. So if you talk about the Q4 growth, which was at 7.4%. If you look at 2 quarters ago, it was 5.6% for the 2 quarters before the Q4. But then if you look at 2 quarters prior to these 2 quarters, then you realize it was 8.4%. So what do we have? We have an 8.4% of growth, which slid down to 5.6% of growth, and now it is going up to 7.4% of growth. So this is the fluctuation that we are talking about. Indian economy is seeing this fluctuation. Now, the puzzle for volatility or the reason for volatility. What is the reason for this volatility? Now, it appears to be quite erratic, as we saw Q2 8.4, then 5.6, and then 7.4. Now, there might be a generic understanding that this fluctuation might be due to the private sector's slowdown and the subsequent rebound. That means the slowdown in the private sector and rebound, and this recovery looks like a V-shaped recovery. What is a V-shaped recovery? Wherever there is a decline and an immediate quick rebound, that's a V-shape. There is another recovery that is known as U-shaped recovery. Now in U-shape, what happens is there is a decline, but for rebound it takes some amount of time. This is the time on this horizontal x-axis, and this is the growth rate on y-axis. So you see in U-shaped recovery the time is more. So here if we consider the last 3 quarters, we have a V-shaped recovery. You need not necessarily call it as an exact recovery because there was not such as a negative growth rate over here, but still if we talk about fluctuation, it is like this. Now, the reason generally could be thought of as the decline in private sector and its subsequent rebound. However, the data does not support this, right? So we'll understand what the real explanation for this decline and rebound is. So if you talk about the GDP gyrations or the fluctuation, this is due to fiscal and exogenous factors. The fiscal expenditure is also included in it. So let us understand what. If you look at this graphics over here, it talks about the election expenses and says that the recently held Lok Sabha elections saw basically double the expenditure than the previous one. In fact, more than double the expenditure than the previous one. Over here it is 55,000 crore and here it is 1.35 lakh crore rupees. It is more than double. It is very close to being triple the expenditure. If you look at the cost of each vote, it has gone up from 700 to 1400 is what the cost of each vote. The cost of each vote has doubled and the expenditure, as we see, has increased. So one reason was the election year government spending, right? So election year government spending, what will happen is the expenditure will be high, so there is a possibility of increased growth that we are seeing over here. Then subsidies. Now subsidies, also huge amount of subsidies etc. are provided. Then you have agriculture. In agriculture, what has happened is the weak H1 but a strong H2. What is H1 and H2? H1 is the first half of the year, H2 is the second half of the year. All this thanks to the monsoon. So because of monsoon, exogenous factor means external factor. So this monsoon is an external factor because of which the H2 has become strong. So all these reasons that we saw so far has nothing to do with the private sector as we were thinking earlier. Now, what are the challenges that lie ahead for India? Now, for India, if you talk about challenge, the challenge is the global turbulence that is happening. Global turbulence means the things that are happening globally, the slowdown in the global economy, the protectionism that is happening worldwide, all those things can then they can put threat or challenge in front of Indian economy. Second is fading post-COVID growth drivers. So of course, in the COVID period, what had happened is there was a negative growth rate. India's GDP actually declined. However, after COVID, there was a rebound that was experienced. Everything, the economy was opening, people were going back out. However, that thrust that we got post-COVID is now fading away. And in certain areas, we have not even achieved numbers prior to the COVID. For example, tourism sector. Now, if you talk about tourism sector, in tourism, if you look at it, the graph was somewhere like this. In COVID, it went down. Now it is somewhere here, which is not even equivalent to the numbers during the COVID year. And even when it is not even reached that level, we are already fading away from the post-COVID growth drivers. The third is the demographic imperative for high growth. What does this sentence mean? This means that for India to have a high growth, there is an imperative requirement, means a compulsory requirement. And what is that compulsory requirement? That is the requirement of demographic dividend. We should achieve demographic dividend if we are to achieve high growth rate, else that will not be possible, is what this sentence says. So that is why demographic dividend, because India is in a phase where it can achieve that. So if you look at approximately having 142 crore or 143 crore, out of this around close to 70%, 68% are people who are in the working age group. So huge working age population is there, huge potential demographic dividend is there, which we need to capitalize. How can we capitalize or benefit from them? Only when we educate this population, skill this population, and keep them in good health. Population, along with education, skill development, and health, leads to human formation, human capital formation, or else it would be a burden. So this is how we can reap the benefits of demographic dividend. In terms of other challenges, there is uncertainty in global trade. For example, the US tariff policies, which led to the US-China trade war. What had happened in US-China trade war? US and China basically had 20% tariff each on each other's goods. However, US increased this tariff to 34%, then 104%, and then finally to 145%. Subsequently, China also increased their tariffs to ultimately 125%, which led to tariff war which was going on. This is impacting the entire world. So this uncertainty is an issue with respect to, because of one factor is this also, which has led to dimming of the export outlook globally. That means in the near future, the export outlook is not that good because of these kind of protectionist tendencies. And then you have the risk of China dumping excess capacity in India. Now, since the tariffs are so high from US ends, China will not put their, will not be exporting their goods to USA that much, right? Even if they are, it will become costly. So US citizens will not be purchasing Chinese imports. So China would look at other avenues to dump their excess goods, and that one of that avenue can be India as well. However, presently there is a 90-day pause on this tariff war, but China is again claiming that US is not obeying the pause criteria that was there. So this kind of uncertainty is again a challenge for India. Now, if we talk about how the growth can happen, there have been rotating growth engines. That means instead of this, something else helps India, then something else helps in India. So let us see what are these revolving doors that we are talking about. So from investment to consumption, from urban to rural, that means the growth this time, instead of getting driven by the investment expenditure, would rather be driven by the consumption expenditure, and instead of being driven by the urban people or the urban economy, it would rather be driven by the local economy is what we are talking about, and the same is very visible by this histogram. So if you look at the private spending, this has increased. If you look at government spending, it has decreased, and if you look at investment, that has decreased as well. So when you look at this, is the main point over here, the investment has declined. So investment going down, how do you still maintain the growth? By consumption expenditure is what it is talking about over here. Now, hope from the rural India, that means instead of the growth in urban, rural India is going. That does not mean in urban India there will be no growth, but rural India have to now chip in, increase in the Manrega demand, the sales of tractors, etc., modernization of agriculture, then FMCG sales, that is the fast moving consumer goods that are there, small consumer goods like toothpaste, toothbrush, all these things, all these grocery, etc., are your part of FMCG. Urban slowdown, this must be offset by rural revival in order for India to have a high growth rate. If you look at India's recent, if you look at what is happening in India presently, inflation was quite high, however that is falling right now. Monetary Policy Committee has for 2 consecutive time reduced the repo rate, and the third time also they will possibly reduce it, so lower interest rate. Sorry, income tax cuts have also come up with new tax slabs, so that is also going to help our growth, and strong monsoon prospect will help to increase in production in the agriculture sector, thus improving our growth. With respect to policy priorities, India should fast track its trade deals with UK, US and European Union in order to have more and more trade. Plus, India should position itself as China +1 alternative. What does this mean? This means, see, if certain countries do not want to deal with China, they would want to look at an alternative. So that is China +1 policy. So India should strive to become that +1 for every other country to deal with if they don't want to deal with China. That is the China +1 strategy. The other policy priority should be with respect to the labor codes, implementation of labor codes. They have been delayed, the reforms. The code is present, but its implementation is delayed. It should not be delayed any further, which will attract FDIs and other countries to work in India. With India, it is going to boost our export, it is going to boost our trade and growth. At the same time, speeding up the monetary transmission. What does this mean? So as the MPC is reducing the repo rates, its effect should be visible in the market, in the different loan rates, deposit rates, so on and so forth. So that is what is meant by speeding up the monetary transmission in order to give effect to what the Monetary Policy Committee is trying to achieve. By doing this, India can keep on growing at a faster rate and be stable rather than the present volatile nature that we have seen. Thank you.